In the sleepy village of St. Mary's, Mead, a master brewer, Tom Carver, is found dead in his own brewery's vat. An accident, or so they say. But Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, sees through the froth of lies. As whispers swirl and secrets bubble up, 4 suspects emerge: a betrayed assistant, an ambitious buyer, a desperate rival, and a loyal worker. With a hidden note, a bloodied wrench, and a trail of greed, Miss Marple unravels a deadly plot where pride and passion brew a perfect murder. Will she catch the killer before the village's heart goes flat? Chapter 1. The Body in the Vat. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary's, Mead, softening the outlines of the village's tidy cottages and the steeple of St. Mary's Church. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the bay window, worked her knitting needles with the precision of a metronome, her eyes drifting to the street below. The village was stirring, but a peculiar hush hung in the air, broken only by the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, who paused to whisper urgently to a neighbor. Miss Marple's ears caught fragments of their conversation. Found dead. Old Oak Brewery. Dreadful accident. And her needles stilled. Death, she knew, was rarely as simple as it seemed, especially when whispers carried such weight. She set her knitting aside, her mind already threading through possibilities. The Old Oak Brewery, a stout stone edifice on the village's western edge, was the heart of St. Mary's, Mead's modest pride. Its ales, crafted by Tom Carver, a man whose ruddy cheeks and hearty laugh were as much a fixture as the church bells, were served in every pub from here to Upper Witchwood. An accident at the brewery was no small matter. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, fetched her sturdy walking stick, and made her way toward the source of the village's unrest. The brewery's iron gates stood ajar, an unusual lapse for a place run with Carver's meticulous care. Inside, the air was thick with the warm, yeasty scent of fermenting barley, undercut by a faint metallic tang that set Miss Marple's senses on edge. Inspector Craddock, a young man whose competence was tempered by a touch of impatience, stood near a massive copper vat, his notebook open. He glanced up as Miss Marple approached, his expression a blend of deference and mild irritation. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to see you here." "Merely a concerned villager, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild, but her eyes sharp as they took in the scene. Tom Carver's body had been removed, but the vat, gleaming and still half full of amber liquid, bore the grim evidence of his discovery. A constable mopped the stone floor where water and beer had pooled, and a ladder stood nearby, its rungs dry and unmarred. Craddock explained the official theory. Carver, inspecting the vat late the previous evening, had slipped, struck his head, and fallen into the brew, drowning before anyone could help. Miss Marple peered into the vat, its surface still rippling faintly. "A tragic mishap," she murmured, though her tone suggested doubt. She noted the ladder's position, too far from the vat's edge for a careless fall, and the absence of scuff marks on the platform above. Her gaze lingered on a faint discoloration on the floor, not beer or water, but something darker, quickly mopped away by the constable. She recalled a case from her youth when a farmer's accidental fall into a well proved to be a push from a jealous brother. Human nature, she thought, had a way of complicating accidents. "Had Mr. Carver been drinking, perhaps?" she asked, her voice innocent. Craddock shook his head. "Not a drop, according to the men who found him. Sober as a judge, they said. He was working late, as usual. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging details. Carver's sobriety ruled out a drunken stumble, and his work ethic suggested he wasn't one to take foolish risks. She glanced at the brewery's workers, huddled near the malt sacks, their faces pale. One, a young lad with nervous hands, avoided her gaze. Another, a woman with calloused fingers and a tight jaw, watched the inspector with an intensity that spoke of more than grief. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The brewery, she sensed, held secrets as layered as its ales. "Inspector," she said softly, "might I suggest a closer look at Mr. Carver's neck? A fall, you see, doesn't always explain every mark." Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he made a note. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room once more. The brewery's rhythm had been disrupted, and not just by death. Something, or someone, had set this tragedy in motion, and she intended to unravel it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 2. The Suspects Assemble. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of the old oak brewery, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over St. Mary's Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag clasped firmly in one hand, navigated the cobbled path with the careful steps of one. Accustomed to observing more than she revealed, the brewery's great oak doors, usually flung wide to welcome delivery carts and curious visitors, were half-closed, guarded by a young constable who nodded respectfully as she passed. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of hops and barley, but the usual hum of activity, clanging barrels, the hiss of steam, the cheerful banter of workers, had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the low murmur of voices from the brewery's office. Inspector Craddock had summoned the 4 individuals closest to the late Tom Carver, ostensibly to clarify their movements on the night of his death. Miss Marple, invited to observe under the thin pretext of offering local insight, knew the inspector's courtesy masked his grudging acknowledgment of her knack for seeing what others missed. She settled into a high-backed chair in the corner of the office, its polished oak walls lined with ledgers and framed certificates proclaiming Old Oak's awards at county fairs. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, moved over the room, taking in every detail: the scuffed floorboards, the ink-stained desk, the faint smudge of grease on a doorframe. Details, she knew, were the threads from which truth was woven. The 4 suspects stood or sat in uneasy proximity, each a study in guarded composure. Ellen Price, the assistant brewer, leaned against a filing cabinet, her arms crossed tightly over her faded work apron. She was a wiry woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her face etched with lines that spoke of long hours and quiet ambition. Her hands, rough from years of handling malt and scrubbing vats, twitched slightly, betraying a restlessness her calm expression belied. Miss Marple noted the way Ellen's gaze flicked toward the door, as if expecting an interruption or an escape. Henry Walsh, the buyer for a chain of pubs in the nearby city of Upper Wychwood, sat at the desk, his polished shoes gleaming under the electric light. A man in his early 40s, he carried the air of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than breweries. His tailored suit, a shade too fine for a village setting, and the gold cufflinks that flashed as he adjusted his tie, suggested a man accustomed to getting his way. Yet his fingers drummed a faint rhythm on the desk, and his eyes darted to the others, assessing, calculating. Miss Marple thought of Mr. Hargreaves, a solicitor she'd known in her youth, whose polished exterior had hidden a ruthless streak. Ambition, she reflected, could be as sharp as a blade. Richard Drayton, the rival brewer from the neighboring town of Lower Witchwood, stood by the window, his broad shoulders filling the frame, his weathered face framed by a shock of graying hair bore the marks of a man who had fought hard battles and lost more than he'd won. Drayton's Ales, his brewery, was a shadow of Old Oak's success, its vats outdated, its reputation fading. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set. But Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in his fingers, the way his eyes lingered on the photograph of Tom Carver, shaking hands with a county official. Rivalry, she knew, could curdle into something darker, as it had in the case of old Mr. Tuttle, who'd sabotaged a neighbor's orchard over a disputed fence. Jack Tully, the youngest of the group, hovered near the door, his lanky frame shifting from foot to foot. Barely 20, with a shock of sandy hair and a face still soft with youth, he clutched a worn cap in his hands, twisting it as if it might anchor him against the weight of suspicion. His work boots, though recently cleaned, bore faint traces of malt dust, and his eyes, wide, almost frightened, kept straying to Ellen. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Young men, she recalled from a case involving a lovesick stable boy, could be fiercely loyal, sometimes to a fault. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, his notebook open on the desk. "Right then," he began, his voice brisk but not unkind. "We're here to establish where each of you was last night, when Mr. Carver met his unfortunate end. Let's keep this straightforward. Miss Price, you first." Ellen straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "I was in the tank room, cleaning the secondary fermenters," she said, her voice steady but clipped. "It was after 7. Tom, Mr. Carver, told me to finish up and lock the side gate when I left. I didn't see him after that. I was done by 8 and went home." Craddock scribbled a note. "Anyone see you there?" Ellen hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "Number." The workers had gone home. It was just me and Tom in the brewery. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her handbag's clasp. Ellen's solitude was convenient. Too convenient, perhaps. She thought of Mrs. Elwood, a housekeeper who'd claimed to be alone polishing silver while her employer was poisoned. Alibis without witnesses, she knew, were like unknotted stitches, easily unraveled. Craddock turned to Henry Walsh, who leaned back in his chair, his smile smooth. "I was in my car, parked just outside the brewery gates," he said. "I'd been meeting with Tom earlier, discussing a contract to distribute Old Oak's ales. I left around 6:30, sat in my car to review some papers, and drove back to the inn by 7:15. You can check with the innkeeper. Mr. Hobbs saw me come in." Miss Marple noted the precision of Henry's timeline, as if rehearsed. His contract, she recalled from village gossip, would have made Old Oak's ales the exclusive supply for his pub chain, a deal worth thousands. She wondered if Tom Carver's hesitation to sign had tested Henry's polished patience. Men like him, she thought, did not take kindly to delays. Richard Drayton spoke next, his voice gruff, like gravel underfoot. "I came to see Tom at 6. We talked about a partnership, combining our breweries to cut costs. He wasn't keen, but we parted on good terms. I left by 7, drove straight home. My wife can confirm when I got back." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Richard's hands, still clasped tightly behind him. His story was plausible, but the tension in his posture suggested more than a failed business deal. She recalled the ledger entry she'd glimpsed earlier, a loan from Carver to Drayton, marked personal. Why would a rival lend such a sum? And why had Richard omitted it? She made a mental note to revisit that thread. Jack Tully's voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I was unloading barley sacks in the storeroom all evening," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Finished around 8, maybe a bit later. Went home after. My mum can tell you I was there by 9. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Anyone see you in the storeroom?" Jack's cheeks flushed. "No, sir, just me. The others had clocked out." Miss Marple studied Jack's nervous fidgeting, the way his eyes darted to Ellen before dropping again. His alibi, like Ellen's, hung on his word alone. She thought of young Tommy Birch, a gardener who'd lied to protect a sweetheart, his loyalty leading him to ruin. Jack's devotion to Ellen was plain, but whether it extended to darker deeds remained unclear. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "That's all for now. Stay in the village, all of you. We'll have more questions." As the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on the desk where Tom Carver's pipe lay untouched, its bowl still half filled with tobacco. She noticed a faint scratch on the desk's edge, barely visible, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A wrench, perhaps? Or a tool from the brewery floor? She filed the detail away, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of the morning's revelations. Stepping outside, she paused by the brewery's great copper vats, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen. The ladder beside the fatal vat caught her eye again, its rungs too clean for a place where workers' boots tracked dust and grime. She bent slightly, her eyes tracing the floor, and noticed a faint smear of grease near the vat's base, distinct from the spilled beer. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew small things could unravel great mysteries. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead years ago, when a single scuff mark on a windowsill had pointed to a burglar's entry. As she walked back to her cottage, the village was alive with whispers. Mrs. Bantry, her friend and chief purveyor of local gossip, waved her over from the post office steps. "Jane, it's dreadful," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. "They're saying Tom Carver was drunk and fell, but I don't believe it. He never touched a drop while working. And you know Ellen Price was set to take over the brewery one day. She told Mrs. Hobbs so. But that Walsh fellow, he was pushing Tom to sell, wasn't he? And Richard Drayton's been losing business to Old Oak for years. As for young Jack Tully, well, he's sweet on Ellen, follows her everywhere. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already sorting the motives Mrs. Bantry had so eagerly laid out. Ellen's dashed hopes, Henry's ambition, Richard's desperation, Jack's loyalty. Each was a thread, and one, she was certain, led to murder. "People talk, Dolly," she said, her voice soft. "But it's what they don't say that matters." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed. The click of her needles was a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. The suspects' stories were too neat, their alibis too solitary. She thought of the grease smear, the unscratched ladder, the bruise on Carver's neck that Craddock had yet to confirm. Someone had been in that vat room with Tom Carver, someone who knew the brewery's rhythms and its secrets. As the afternoon light faded, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The truth, she knew, was there, waiting to be unraveled, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The evening air in St. Mary's Mead carried a crisp edge, the kind that sharpened the senses and set the village's tongues wagging with renewed vigor. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, walked the short distance from her cottage to the high street, her steps measured but purposeful. The lamps were just beginning to glow, casting a soft light on the familiar facades of the post office, the butcher's shop, and the Blue Boar Inn, where villagers gathered to dissect the day's tragedy. The death of Tom Carver at the Old Oak Brewery had stirred the village like a stone dropped in a still pond, and Miss Marple knew that gossip, if sifted carefully, could yield truths as surely as any inspector's notebook. She paused outside the post office, where a cluster of women stood, their voices low but animated. Mrs. Hobbs, the innkeeper's wife, was holding court, her plump hands gesturing with the authority of one who dispensed both ale and information. "It's a scandal, that's what it is," she declared, her cheeks flushed. "Tom Carver, drowned in his own vat? I don't believe it was an accident, not for a moment. He knew those vats like the back of his hand. Someone pushed him, mark my words." Miss Marple lingered just out of sight, her presence unnoticed as she listened. Mrs. Hobbs's words were not evidence, but they were a thread, and Miss Marple was adept at following threads. She recalled a case from years past, when the village had buzzed with talk of a dairyman's fall from a hayloft, only for her quiet inquiries to reveal a jealous rival's hand. Gossip, she knew, was the raw wool of human nature, full of knots but rich with possibility. She made her way to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had promised tea and, inevitably, more talk. The vicarage parlor was a cozy haven, its walls lined with books and its windows overlooking a garden where roses still bloomed despite the autumn chill. Mrs. Clement, a gentle woman with a knack for hearing confessions, poured tea from a chipped porcelain pot. "Jane, it's dreadful about Tom Carver," she said, her voice soft, but her eyes keen. "The village is in a state. They're saying Ellen Price was to inherit the brewery, you know. She's been his shadow for years, learning every recipe, every trick. But now there's talk he was going to sell to that city man, Mr. Walsh." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over this new piece. Ellen's ambition had been clear in the brewery office, but the prospect of a sale would have been a bitter blow. "Did Ellen know of this plan?" she asked, her tone mild. Mrs. Clement hesitated, stirring her tea. Mrs. Bantry heard it from the grocer, who got it from Ellen's neighbor. Apparently, Ellen was in a temper last week, saying Tom had betrayed her trust. She thought the brewery was her future. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the handle of her cup. Betrayal could drive even the steadiest hand to violence, as she'd seen in the case of Miss Harrow, who'd poisoned a cousin over a disputed inheritance. Ellen's grief in the office had seemed genuine, but grief could be a mask, and Miss Marple was not one to be fooled by surfaces. The conversation turned to the other suspects. "That Richard Drayton," Mrs. Clement said, lowering her voice as if the walls might overhear. "He's been struggling, hasn't he? Drayton's ales can't hold a candle to Old Oak. The vicar heard him at the market last month, complaining that Tom was undercutting his prices. And then there's young Jack Tully, always trailing after Ellen like a lost lamb. He's a good lad, but you know how boys can be when they're smitten." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Jack's devotion had been plain in his nervous glances, but loyalty could twist into something darker. She thought of a young clerk who'd once forged a will to please his beloved, only to find himself in handcuffs. "And Mr. Walsh?" she prompted. Mrs. Clement's eyes widened. "Oh, he's a sharp one. Staying at the Blue Boar, throwing money around like he owns the place. Mrs. Hobbs says he was pressing Tom to sign that contract, but Tom kept putting him off, said he wanted to keep the brewery independent." This aligned with what Miss Marple had heard in the village, but it added a new shade to Henry Walsh's polished demeanor. A man with a fortune at stake might grow impatient, and impatience could lead to rash acts. She made a mental note to inquire further about Walsh's movements. As she left the vicarage, the village was settling into its evening rhythm, the lights of the Blue Boar glowing warmly. Miss Marple decided to stop by, knowing the inn was a hub of talk. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke, and a dozen villagers sat at tables, their voices a low hum. She took a seat near the bar, where Mr. Hobbs, a burly man with a florid face, was polishing glasses. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but curious. "Terrible business at the brewery." "Indeed," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. "The village seems quite shaken." Mr. Hobbs leaned closer, his voice dropping. "They're all talking, miss. Some say Tom slipped, but I knew him. Steady as a rock he was, never climbed a ladder without checking it twice. And that Richard Drayton was here last night. You know, drinking alone till late. Looked like he'd had a row with someone?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Was he now? And what time did he leave?" "Past 9, I'd say," Mr. Hobbs replied, wiping a glass with unnecessary vigor. "His car was still outside when I locked up." This contradicted Richard's claim of leaving the brewery by 7. Miss Marple's mind turned to the note she'd glimpsed in Carver's office, scheduling a meeting with R.D. at 8. If Richard had lingered, he could have been at the brewery when Carver died. She thanked Mr. Hobbs and stepped outside, the cool air clearing her thoughts. On her way home, she passed the church, where the organist was practicing a somber hymn. The sound followed her as she considered the web of motives forming in her mind. Ellen's dashed dreams, Richard's failing business, Henry's ambition, Jack's loyalty. Each was a strand, and one led to the truth. She recalled a case from her girlhood when a village seamstress had been found dead, her death blamed on a fall, until Miss Marple's aunt had noticed a misplaced thimble that pointed to a jealous rival. Small things, she knew, could unravel great crimes. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The village's whispers had given her much to ponder, but whispers were not enough. She needed facts, hard, unyielding facts, to stitch together the truth. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would visit the brewery again, to see what else the vats and ledgers might reveal. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the hymn's faint echo guide her thoughts through the tangled threads of St. Mary's Mead. Chapter 4. The Brewer's Ledger. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. She sat at her small writing desk, her knitting set aside for the moment, her mind occupied with the threads of suspicion that had begun to weave themselves into a pattern. The death of Tom Carver at the Old Oak Brewery was no mere accident, of that she was certain. The bruise on his neck, the pristine ladder, the faint smear of grease near the vat, all were stitches in a tapestry that pointed to murder. But to unravel it, she needed more than village whispers. She needed evidence, and the brewery itself, she suspected, held the key. After a light breakfast of tea and toast, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her walking stick tapping softly as she made her way to the brewery. The village was quieter now, the initial shock of Carver's death settling into a murmur of unease. The old oak's gates stood open, but the courtyard was empty save for a lone worker sweeping malt dust from the cobbles. Miss Marple nodded to him, her smile disarming, and slipped into the brewery's main building, where the air was thick with the warm, earthy scent of fermentation. Inspector Craddock was not present, having been called to Upper Witchwood on another matter, but the young constable at the door recognized her and allowed her to pass with a respectful, if slightly puzzled, nod. "Just looking about, dear," she said, her voice as mild as milk. "An old woman's curiosity, you know." The constable, accustomed to Miss Marple's presence at such scenes, did not press her further. She made her way to Tom Carver's office, a small room tucked behind the brewing floor, its walls lined with shelves of ledgers and jars of dried hops. The desk was as she'd seen it yesterday, cluttered with papers, a pipe, and a well-worn blotter. But today she had time to examine it closely. She settled into the chair, her fingers moving with the precision of one, accustomed to untangling knots, and opened the ledger that lay prominently on the desk. The pages were a testament to Carver's meticulous nature, each entry recorded in his neat, slanting hand. Sales, shipments, and expenses were logged with care, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to an entry dated 2 weeks prior, a loan of £5,000 to R. Drayton, personal. The word personal was underlined twice, as if Carver had hesitated before writing it. She frowned, her mind turning to Richard Drayton's grim face in the office yesterday. A loan to a rival was unusual, especially one struggling as Drayton's ales was known to be. She recalled a case from her youth when a grocer had lent money to a failing competitor, only to be betrayed when the debt went unpaid. Generosity, she knew, could breed resentment as easily as gratitude. Flipping further, she found a draft contract tucked between the pages, its edges creased as if handled often. It was an agreement with Henry Walsh, the buyer, granting his pub chain exclusive rights to distribute Old Oak's ales across 3 counties. The terms were generous. Too generous, perhaps, for a man like Carver, who valued his brewery's independence. The contract was unsigned, and a note in the margin in Carver's hand read, "Discuss with E.P. before final." E.P., Ellen Price, no doubt. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Ellen had spoken of Carver as a mentor, a father figure, but this contract suggested he'd been considering a deal that could undermine her future. Her fingers brushed the blotter, and she noticed its corner was slightly lifted, as if something had been slipped beneath. Lifting it carefully, she found a scrap of paper, its edges torn, bearing a single line in Carver's hand. "Meet R.D. 8 p.m., Vat Room." The date was the night of his death. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Richard Drayton had claimed he left the brewery by 7, yet this note placed him at the scene an hour later. She tucked the scrap into her handbag, her mind already threading it into the pattern. Stepping away from the desk, she examined the room further. A heavy brass paperweight, shaped like a hop cone, sat on a shelf, its surface gleaming but for a faint scratch along its edge. She bent closer, her eyes narrowing. The scratch was fresh, the metal beneath bright against the tarnished patina. It could mean nothing, or it could mean a struggle, a hasty movement in a moment of violence. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a scratched candlestick had pointed to a thief's clumsy exit. Small marks, she knew, could tell great stories. She moved to the window, which overlooked the vat room. The great copper vats gleamed below, their surfaces reflecting the dim light of the overhead lamps. The ladder by the fatal vat was still in place, its rungs unmarred, but Miss Marple's gaze fell to the floor beneath. The smear of grease she'd noticed yesterday was gone, cleaned by the diligent constable, but she remembered its position, near the vat's base, where no worker would leave such a mark carelessly. It suggested haste, perhaps a tool dropped and quickly retrieved. A wrench, she thought, or something heavier. As she left the office, she paused by the vat room, where a worker was scrubbing the platform above the vats. He glanced at her, his face weary, and she offered a gentle smile. "Such a terrible loss," she said, her voice soft. "Did Mr. Carver often work late in here?" The worker, a grizzled man named Ted, nodded. "Aye, miss. Tom was always checking the vats, tasting the brew. Said it was his life's work. Never saw him clumsy, though. Not once." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And that night? Did you see anyone else about?" Ted hesitated, his cloth pausing on the railing. "I left at 6, miss, but I heard Richard Drayton's voice earlier, talking with Tom. Sounded heated, though I couldn't catch the words. And young Jack Tully was still here, moving sacks in the storeroom." She thanked him and stepped outside, the cool air sharpening her thoughts. The ledger, the contract, the note, the scratch, the grease, each was a thread, and together they pointed to a confrontation in the vat room. Richard Drayton's lie about his departure was troubling, but so was Ellen's silence about the contract. Henry Walsh's ambition loomed large, and Jack Tully's presence in the storeroom placed him near the scene. Miss Marple's mind turned to a case from her girlhood, when a ledger's hidden entry had revealed a motive for murder. Paper, she knew, could be as deadly as a weapon. As she walked back to her cottage, the village was stirring with its usual rhythm, but the brewery's shadow lingered. She passed Mrs. Bantry on the high street, who waved her over with a gleam in her eye. "Jane, have you heard? They're saying Tom's death wasn't an accident at all. The police found a mark on his neck, like he was struck before he fell. What do you make of that?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "People do talk, Dolly, but it's the quiet ones we must listen to." She said no more, her mind already weaving the new thread into the pattern. The brewery's secrets were beginning to unravel, and she would follow them, stitch by careful stitch, until the truth lay bare. Chapter 5. The Assistant's Secret. The late morning light filtered through the elms lining the lane to Ellen Price's cottage, a modest stone dwelling nestled on the outskirts of St. Mary's Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm on the path, approached with the air of one paying a neighborly call, though her sharp eyes missed nothing: the neatly trimmed hop vines climbing the garden wall, the faint scuff of boots on the doorstep, the curtain twitching slightly at the window. The village was still abuzz with Tom Carver's death, but Miss Marple knew that truth often hid in quiet corners, where grief and guilt intertwined like threads in a skein. Ellen's cottage was a brewer's haven, its garden fragrant with the bitter tang of hops, and its windowsills lined with jars of dried herbs used in ale-making. Miss Marple knocked softly, her knock as unassuming as her gray coat, and Ellen opened the door, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes were wary. "I didn't expect you. Come in." The parlor was small but tidy, its furniture worn but polished, a testament to Ellen's practical nature. A copper brewing kettle gleamed on a sideboard, and a photograph on the mantel caught Miss Marple's eye. Ellen and Tom Carver, younger, their faces alight with laughter at what appeared to be a beer festival, their hands raised in a toast. The image suggested a bond beyond the brewery's walls, and Miss Marple filed it away as she accepted a chair and a cup of tea. "I wanted to offer my condolences, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "Mr. Carver's death must be a great shock to you, working so closely with him." Ellen nodded, her hands busy with the teapot, though her fingers trembled slightly. "It is. He was more than a boss. He taught me everything. How to balance the hops, how to time the mash just right. He said I had a gift for it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but probing. "He must have valued you greatly. I understand he spoke of you taking over the brewery one day." Ellen's jaw tightened, and she set the teapot down with a faint clink. "He did. Years ago, he promised I'd run Old Oak when he retired, said I was like a daughter to him." Her voice caught and she looked away, her gaze settling on the photograph. "But lately, he was different, distant, talking about deals with that Walsh fellow." Miss Marple's mind turned to the unsigned contract she'd found in Carver's ledger, granting Henry Walsh exclusive distribution rights. It would have sidelined Ellen's ambitions, perhaps even her livelihood. "That must have been disappointing," she said, her voice as soft as the ticking of the mantel clock. Ellen's eyes flashed, a spark of anger breaking through her grief. "Disappointing? It was a betrayal. I gave 10 years to that brewery, learning every recipe, every trick. And then he starts negotiating with some city man who doesn't know a stout from a porter. I told him it was a mistake, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple noted the heat in Ellen's words, the way her hands clenched in her lap. She thought of Mrs. Langley, a cook who'd once sabotaged a rival's kitchen over a promised promotion that never came. Resentment, she knew, could fester into something dangerous. "Did you speak to him about it that night?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. Ellen's face closed like a shutter. "Number I was cleaning the tanks, like I told the inspector. I left by 8 and came home. I didn't see Tom after 7. The answer was too quick, too rehearsed, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Ellen's alibi, like Jack Tully's, lacked a witness, and her anger at Carver's change of heart was a motive as clear as the tea in her cup. She glanced around the room, noting a pair of work gloves on a side table, their leather stained with grease. They were small, suited to a woman's hands, and the grease reminded her of the smear she'd seen near the vat. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple distrusted coincidences. Changing tack, she gestured to the photograph. "You and Mr. Carver seem very close in that picture. It must be a comfort to have such memories." Ellen's expression softened, her fingers brushing the frame. "That was the county fair 5 years ago. We won first prize for our amber ale. Tom was so proud. He said it was our best yet." Her voice broke, and she turned away, busying herself with the tea tray. Miss Marple watched her closely, her mind weaving threads. Ellen's grief was real, but so was her anger, and the two could coexist in a heart torn by betrayal. She recalled a case from her youth, when a governess had wept for her employer while hiding a letter that proved her guilt. "You must miss him terribly," she said, her voice warm but probing. Did anyone else share such a bond with him? Ellen hesitated, her hands stilling. Jack Tully looked up to him, I suppose, always asking Tom questions, trying to learn the trade. But it wasn't the same. Tom trusted me with the recipes, the brewery's heart. No one else. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the omission of Richard Drayton and Henry Walsh. Ellen's loyalty to Carver was clear, but so was her sense of ownership over the brewery. Had that sense been threatened enough to drive her to violence? She thought of the note in Carver's office, scheduling a meeting with R.D. at 8. Ellen had claimed to leave by then, but the grease on her gloves suggested she'd been near machinery, or a tool, that night. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small notebook by the door, its cover worn, but its pages bulging with notes. "Your brewing notes, dear?" she asked, her tone light. Ellen flushed, snatching the notebook up. Just recipes, ideas for new ales. Nothing important. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was alert. The notebook's hurried concealment suggested secrets, perhaps not of murder, but of something Ellen wished to keep hidden. She thanked her hostess and stepped into the garden, the scent of hops lingering in the air. As she walked back to the village, she passed Jack Tully, his lanky frame bent as he carried a sack of grain toward the brewery. His eyes flicked to Ellen's cottage, and Miss Marple noted the flush in his cheeks, the way his steps slowed as if hoping for a glimpse of her. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. Ellen's anger, her gloves, her notebook, each was a thread, and the photograph suggested a bond that might have deepened her sense of betrayal. Jack's devotion to Ellen added another layer, one Miss Marple knew could lead to rash acts. She recalled a young man in St. Mary's Mead who'd stolen from his employer to impress a girl, only to find himself in jail. The brewery's secrets were piling up, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Rival's Burden. The gray clouds that had gathered over St. Mary's Mead by mid-afternoon did little to dampen the village's curiosity, though they cast a somber pall over the lanes leading to Lower Witchwood, where Richard Drayton's brewery stood. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under one arm and her handbag clasped firmly, made her way along the winding road, her steps deliberate despite the threat of rain. The journey to Drayton's Ales was not one she undertook lightly, but the note in Tom Carver's office, "Meet R.D. 8 p.m., vat room," and Richard's claim of leaving the Old Oak Brewery by 7 had snagged in her mind like a loose thread in a shawl. She intended to tug at it. Drayton's Ales occupied a sagging brick building by the river, its chimneys silent and its yard overgrown with weeds. The contrast to Old Oak's gleaming vats and bustling courtyard was stark, and Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the peeling paint, the cracked windows, and the air of neglect that hung about the place like a fog. The brewery's struggles were no secret in St. Mary's Mead. Mrs. Bantry had spoken of Richard Drayton's mounting debts and dwindling customers, outshone by Tom Carver's superior brews. Yet the £5,000 loan from Carver to Drayton, marked personal in the ledger, suggested a complexity to their rivalry that Miss Marple was eager to unravel. She knocked at the brewery's office door, and after a moment, Richard himself opened it, his broad frame filling the doorway. His face, weathered and lined, darkened at the sight of her, though he managed a gruff nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice like the scrape of a barrel on stone. "Didn't expect you here. Come to poke about, have you?" "Merely a neighborly visit," she replied, her smile as disarming as the lace at her collar. "I thought you might be feeling the loss of Mr. Carver, given your long acquaintance." Richard's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside, gesturing her into the cramped office. The room was a study in disarray, papers strewn across a desk, a cracked mug half filled with cold tea, and a heavy iron wrench resting on a shelf, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the wrench, noting its weight and the faint shine of grease on its grip. It was the kind of tool that could leave a bruise like the one she'd glimpsed on Tom Carver's neck, though she kept her expression serene as she settled into a creaking chair. Richard remained standing, his hands thrust into his pockets. "Tom and I went back years," he said, his tone grudging. "Rivals, yes, but we respected each other. He lent me money when my brewery was in trouble, £5,000 to keep the vats running. Said he didn't want to see me go under." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "That was generous of him. Most rivals would let a competitor sink." Richard's laugh was bitter, like overbrewed ale. "Generous? Maybe. Or maybe he just wanted to keep me in his debt so he could lord it over me. Tom was good at that, smiling while he won." The words carried a sting, and Miss Marple noted the resentment in his tone, the way his fingers clenched in his pockets. She thought of Mr. Greaves, a farmer who'd once harbored a grudge against a neighbor for a similar act of charity, his pride wounded more deeply than his purse. "You met with him the night he died, I believe," she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "To discuss a partnership?" Richard's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Aye, I went to Old Oak at 6, talked about merging our breweries, sharing costs. Tom wasn't interested, said his ales were doing fine without me. We argued a bit, but I left by 7, went to the Blue Boar for a pint, then home." Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag, where the scrap of paper with the 8 p.m. meeting note lay hidden. Richard's timeline did not align with the note, nor with Mr. Hobbs's claim that his car was still outside the inn past 9. She recalled a case from her girlhood, when a shopkeeper's lie about his whereabouts had unraveled under the weight of a single witness's testimony. "It must have been disheartening," she said, her tone sympathetic, "especially with the talk of Mr. Carver selling to Mr. Walsh." Richard's face flushed, and he turned to the window, his shoulders rigid. "Tom mentioned that deal, said it'd make Old Oak bigger than ever. I told him it'd ruin the village, handing our trade to some city man. He laughed, said I was just jealous. Maybe I was, but I didn't kill him." The denial came too quickly, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She glanced at the wrench again, its presence as conspicuous as a dropped stitch. "That's a fine tool," she remarked, nodding toward it. "Do you use it often?" Richard followed her gaze, his expression tightening. "Just for repairs. Vats get stuck sometimes." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said, her smile placid. "I simply notice things. Old habits, you know." She rose, thanking him for his time, but as she stepped toward the door, she paused by a stack of crates in the corner. A torn scrap of paper, caught in a splinter, bore the logo of Drayton's Ales. It was small, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple's mind flashed to the vat room at Old Oak, where a similar scrap might have gone unnoticed by the police. She left it where it was, knowing better than to disturb what might later prove significant. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a light drizzle began to fall as she opened her umbrella. The road back to St. Mary's Mead was quiet, save for the distant rumble of a cart, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Richard's words. His resentment was palpable, his alibi shaky, and the wrench in his office was a troubling detail. The loan from Carver, meant as a lifeline, could have felt like a chain to a proud man like Drayton, especially if Carver's deal with Walsh threatened to crush his brewery entirely. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead where a blacksmith had struck a rival over a disputed debt, his temper flaring in a single, fatal moment. As she neared the village, she passed the Blue Boar, where a group of men stood under the awning, their voices low. One, a brewery worker named Sam, caught her eye and tipped his cap. "Miss Marple," he said, "heard you were at Drayton's today." Folks say Richard was in a right state after seeing Tom that night. Saw his car near Old Oak well after dark, I did. Miss Marple's smile was faint but encouraging. "Did you now? And what time might that have been?" "Close to 9, I'd say," Sam replied, scratching his chin. Thought it odd, him lingering like that. She thanked him and continued on, her mind weaving the new thread into the pattern. Richard's lie about his departure, the note, the wrench, the scrap of paper, all pointed to a confrontation in the vat room, one that had ended in violence. But she needed more than threads. She needed proof, as solid as the stones beneath her feet. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit the lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The fire crackled as she considered the weight of Richard's burden, debt, rivalry, and a meeting that had likely turned deadly. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would speak to Inspector Craddock about the wrench and the scrap of paper. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the rain outside guide her thoughts through the tangled skein of St. Mary's Mead's latest tragedy. Chapter 7. The Buyer's Ambition. The drizzle that had begun the previous day had settled into a steady rain by noon, cloaking St. Mary's Mead in a soft gray haze. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, adjusted her umbrella and made her way to the Blue Boar Inn, where Henry Walsh, the city buyer with his polished shoes and sharper ambitions, was staying. Her steps were slow but purposeful, her mind threading through the details of Tom Carver's death, the bruise on his neck, the note scheduling a meeting with R.D., the grease-stained wrench in Richard Drayton's office, and the unsigned contract that could have changed the fate of Old Oak Brewery. Henry Walsh, with his city manners and lucrative deal, was a key figure in this tapestry, and Miss Marple intended to examine his threads closely. The Blue Boar was a warm contrast to the damp street, its oak-paneled walls glowing under the flicker of gas lamps. The scent of roasting meat mingled with the tang of ale, and a low hum of conversation filled the air, though it hushed slightly as Miss Marple entered. Her presence, unassuming yet oddly commanding, drew glances from the regulars, who knew her reputation for seeing what others missed. She spotted Henry Walsh at a corner table, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the rough tweeds of the villagers. He was reading a newspaper, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table. But he looked up as she approached, his smile smooth as polished brass. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with a courteous nod. "An unexpected pleasure. Will you join me for tea?" "Very kind of you, Mr. Walsh," she replied, settling into a chair with a rustle of her coat. "I thought we might chat about poor Mr. Carver. Such a loss to the village." Henry's smile tightened, but he signaled the barmaid for a fresh pot of tea. Tragic, yes. Tom was a fine brewer. His ales were unmatched, which is why I wanted them for my pubs. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, studied him over the rim of her teacup. His manner was polished, but there was a hardness beneath it, like the edge of a blade hidden in velvet. She recalled Mr. Thornton, a London merchant she'd met years ago, whose charm had masked a ruthless streak when a deal went sour. "You were negotiating a contract with him, I believe," she said, her voice as gentle as the rain outside. "To distribute Old Oak's ales?" Henry nodded, leaning back in his chair. "A straightforward arrangement. My chain would take Old Oak's entire output, exclusive rights across 3 counties. It would have made Tom a wealthy man and put his ales in every pub from here to the coast. He was keen at first, but lately he'd been dragging his feet." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the handle of her handbag, where the scrap of paper with Carver's note lay. The unsigned contract she'd found in the ledger suggested hesitation, perhaps influenced by Ellen Price's objections. "That must have been frustrating," she said, her tone sympathetic. "A man of your position, with so much at stake." Henry's eyes narrowed, but his smile held. "Business is patience, Miss Marple. I wasn't worried. Tom would have come around. He knew the deal was too good to pass up." The barmaid set down a tray with tea and scones, and Miss Marple poured, her movements deliberate. She noted the faint tremor in Henry's hand as he reached for his cup, the way his eyes flicked to the door as if expecting an interruption. "You were at the brewery that evening, I understand," she said, her voice as light as the steam rising from the teapot. "Reviewing papers in your car?" "Exactly," Henry said, his tone brisk. "I met Tom at 6, went over the contract again. He said he needed more time, something about consulting his assistant. I left by 6:30, sat in my car to make some notes, and drove back here by 7:15. Mr. Hobbs can confirm when I returned." Miss Marple nodded, recalling Mr. Hobbs's confirmation, but also the chambermaid's gossip, overheard by Mrs. Bantry, that Henry had been on the telephone that night, arguing about delays. She thought of a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a businessman's impatience had led to a forged deed and a violent end. "It's curious," she said, her tone musing, "how a deal so promising could cause such tension. Did Mr. Carver mention any concerns?" Henry's fingers paused on his cup, and for a moment his polish slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. "He was stubborn, that's all. Kept talking about tradition, keeping the brewery local. I told him sentiment doesn't pay bills, but he wouldn't listen. Still, I didn't push. There's always another brewery." The words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the edge beneath them, like a snag in silk. She sipped her tea, her mind turning to the telephone call. "You must have been busy that evening," she said, her eyes soft but probing. "Calls to make? Plans to adjust?" Henry's smile returned, but it was tighter now. "Just business as usual, nothing out of the ordinary." She let the silence linger, knowing it could unsettle more than questions. As she buttered a scone, she glanced around the inn, noting the chambermaid, a young woman named Lily, polishing a mirror nearby. Lily's eyes met hers briefly, and Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later. Gossip, she knew, was often the key to locked doors. Changing tack, she gestured to Henry's cufflinks, gold and engraved with a crest. "Those are quite fine," she said, her tone admiring. A family heirloom, perhaps? Henry glanced at them, his expression softening. A gift from my father. He started the pub chain, said appearances matter in business. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. A man who valued appearances might go to great lengths to secure a deal, especially one that could cement his reputation. She recalled a case from her youth, when a dapper salesman had resorted to blackmail to close a contract, his charm a mask for desperation. "And your business must keep you very busy," she said. "No time to linger at the brewery after your meeting?" Henry's eyes flicked to hers, sharp and wary. "As I said, I was back here by 7:15. I had calls to make, letters to write, no reason to stay." She smiled, her expression as placid as the rain-soaked street outside, but her mind was weaving threads. The contract, the telephone argument, the bruise on Carver's neck. Henry's alibi was solid, but his ambition was a motive as clear as the glass in her hand. She thanked him for the tea and rose, promising to call again if she had more questions. As she stepped into the inn's foyer, she caught Lily's eye and paused. "Lily, dear," she said, her voice low, "you must hear all sorts of things working here. Did Mr. Walsh make any calls the night Mr. Carver died?" Lily glanced around, then leaned closer. "He was on the telephone in his room, miss, around 8. I heard him through the door, sounding cross. Something about no more delays and getting it done. I didn't catch more. Mrs. Hobbs called me away." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind buzzing. The call placed Henry in the inn at 8, but his words suggested urgency, perhaps a plan set in motion. She stepped outside, the rain pattering on her umbrella as she made her way home. The village was quiet, the blue boar's lights fading behind her, but her thoughts were alive with possibilities. Henry's ambition, Richard's lie, Ellen's betrayal, Jack's loyalty. Each was a thread, and one, she was certain, led to the truth. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit the fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. The rain's rhythm matched the click of her thoughts as she considered Henry's polished exterior and the cracks beneath. Tomorrow, she would press Inspector Craddock about the bruise and the wrench, and perhaps revisit the brewery to look for that scrap of Drayton's Ales paper. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the threads of St. Mary's Mead's tragedy weave themselves into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 8. The Worker's Loyalty. The rain had softened to a fine mist by the following morning, cloaking St. Mary's Mead in a silvery sheen that lent an air of quiet mystery to the village. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella folded but her senses sharp, made her way to the village shop, where young Jack Tully was known to run errands for his mother. The threads of Tom Carver's murder were knitting together in her mind, the bruise on his neck, the note placing Richard Drayton at the brewery, the wrench in Drayton's office, the unsigned contract with Henry Walsh, and Ellen Price's concealed anger. But Jack, with his nervous glances and unspoken devotion to Ellen, remained a loose stitch. Miss Marple knew that loyalty, especially in youth, could lead to reckless acts, and she intended to test the strength of Jack's thread. The shop, a cramped space filled with the scent of fresh bread and polished wood, was bustling with morning customers. Mrs. Wicks, the shopkeeper, stood behind the counter, her hands deftly wrapping parcels as she dispensed gossip with equal efficiency. Jack was there, his lanky frame bent over a crate of apples, his cap pulled low. Miss Marple approached, her smile as gentle as the mist outside. "Good morning, Jack," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "Might I have a word?" Jack started, his hands fumbling with an apple that rolled onto the floor. He retrieved it, his cheeks flushing, and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Just finishing here." Mrs. Wicks, catching Miss Marple's eye, shooed Jack toward the back of the shop. "Go on, lad. I'll manage. Miss Marple doesn't call without reason." Her tone held a mix of curiosity and respect, for the village knew Miss Marple's knack for unraveling secrets. They stepped into a small storeroom, its shelves lined with tins and sacks of flour. Jack stood awkwardly, twisting his cap in his hands, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple settled onto a wooden stool, her handbag resting on her lap, and studied him. His youth was evident in the softness of his features, but there was a tension in his posture, like a spring coiled too tightly. She recalled a case from her girlhood, when a young footman's loyalty to a wayward heiress had led him to hide evidence of theft. Loyalty, she knew, could blind as easily as it bound. "You must be terribly shaken by Mr. Carver's death," she began, her tone warm. "You worked closely with him, didn't you?" Jack nodded, his voice low. "Aye, miss. Tom, Mr. Carver, was good to me. Gave me a job when I had nothing. Taught me how to handle the barley, check the vats. Said I could learn the trade if I stuck at it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "And you were at the brewery that night, moving sacks in the storeroom?" "Yes, ma'am," Jack said quickly, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Finished around 8, maybe a bit later. Went straight home. My mum can tell you." His words were rehearsed, echoing his statement to Inspector Craddock, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hands, the way his fingers tightened on the cap. She thought of the malt dust on his boots she'd noticed in the brewery office, a detail suggesting he'd been near the vats, not just the storeroom. "It must be hard work, moving those heavy sacks alone," she said, her voice musing. "No one to help you that evening?" Jack shook his head, his flush deepening. "No, miss. The others had gone. Just me, like I said." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, knowing it could loosen tongues more effectively than questions. She glanced around the storeroom, noting a pair of work boots in the corner, their soles crusted with the same pale dust she'd seen at the brewery. "You're very fond of Miss Price, aren't you?" she asked, her tone as gentle as a lullaby. Jack's head jerked up, his eyes wide. "Ellen? She's a good sort, knows the brewery better than anyone. Tom always said so." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile encouraging. "I understand she was to take over Old Oak one day. It must have been upsetting to hear talk of a sale to Mr. Walsh." Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment his eyes flashed with something fiercer than nerves. "Tom shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low but fervent. "Ellen deserved the brewery. She worked for it, gave everything. That city man, Walsh, he didn't care about the ales, just the money." The passion in his words was unmistakable, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the grease-stained gloves in Ellen's cottage, the smear near the vat. Jack's loyalty to Ellen could have driven him to act, perhaps to confront Carver or protect her interests. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a young gardener had attacked a rival to win his sweetheart's favor, his devotion blinding him to consequence. "Did you ever speak to Mr. Carver about it?" she asked, her eyes soft but probing. Jack's hands stilled on his cap, and he looked away. "No, miss. Wasn't my place. I just did my work." His denial was too quick, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She noticed a small cut on his knuckle, fresh and scabbed, as if from a recent scrape. It could mean nothing, a hazard of brewery work, but it could also mean a struggle, a moment of violence near the vats. She thought of the wrench in Richard Drayton's office, its handle greased, and wondered if Jack's hands had wielded a similar tool. "You must be careful, working with all those heavy tools," she said, her tone light. "Breweries can be dangerous places." Jack's eyes flicked to his hand, and he tucked it behind his back. "Aye, miss, gotta watch yourself." She rose, thanking him for his time, but as she stepped toward the door, she paused by the boots in the corner. "Those look well worn," she remarked. "Do you clean them often?" Jack flushed again, his voice stumbling. "Not much, miss." "Too busy." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said, her smile placid. "Just an old woman's curiosity." But her mind was weaving threads, the malt dust, the cut, Jack's fierce loyalty to Ellen. Each was a stitch, and together they suggested he'd been closer to the vat room than he admitted. As she left the shop, the mist had lifted, and the village sparkled under a tentative sun. Miss Marple made her way to the Blue Boar, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting with a fresh batch of gossip. Over tea, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Jane, they're saying Jack Tully was at the brewery late that night, despite what he told the police. Old Ted, the worker, saw him near the vats, not just the storeroom. And you know he's head over heels for Ellen. Do you think he'd do something foolish for her?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the new thread. "Young men can be impulsive, Dolly," she said, her voice soft. "But it's the why that matters." Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting untouched as she considered Jack's words and the cut on his hand. His loyalty to Ellen was a motive, but so was Richard's resentment and Henry's ambition. The grease, the wrench, the note, all pointed to a confrontation, but Jack's presence near the vats added a new layer. She recalled a case from her youth, when a boy's devotion had led him to hide a crime, his silence as damning as any act. Tomorrow, she would press Inspector Craddock to examine the vat room for traces of that scrap of Drayton's Ales paper, and perhaps test the wrench for more than grease. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the fire's warmth guide her thoughts through the tangled skein of St. Mary's Mead's tragedy. Chapter 9. The Pieces Align. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary's Mead, casting a golden glow on the village's thatched roofs and cobblestone lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage's small parlor, her knitting needles idle in their basket, her mind weaving the threads of Tom Carver's murder into a tighter pattern. The bruise on his neck, the note scheduling a meeting with R.D., the grease-stained wrench in Richard Drayton's office, the unsigned contract with Henry Walsh, Ellen Price's hidden anger, and Jack Tully's fierce loyalty. Each was a stitch, and now, 9 days after the brewer's death, the tapestry was beginning to take shape. She knew the truth was near, but it required one final tug to pull the threads taut. She had invited Inspector Craddock for tea, a pretext he accepted with a mix of amusement and wariness, knowing her invitations often led to revelations. He arrived promptly at 3, his hat in hand, his face bearing the strain of a case that refused to resolve neatly. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chintz-covered chair, "I hope you've got something to make sense of this mess. The coroners confirmed the bruise on Carver's neck wasn't from a fall. He was struck, likely with something heavy, before he went into the vat." Miss Marple poured tea from a silver pot, her movements as precise as her thoughts. "That is most illuminating, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but sharp-edged. "A blow suggests intent, not accident. Have you considered what might have delivered it?" Craddock nodded, stirring his tea. "We're looking at tools in the brewery. A wrench, maybe, or a pipe. The problem is, every worker handles those things daily. No clear fingerprints yet." She passed him a scone, her eyes bright with purpose. "There was a wrench in Mr. Drayton's office, I believe, heavy, with a greased handle, and a scrap of paper from Drayton's ales, possibly overlooked in the vat room. Have your men checked there?" Craddock's eyebrows rose, but he made a note. "You've been busy, haven't you? We'll look into it. Drayton's story doesn't add up. He said he left by 7, but a worker saw his car near the brewery at 9. And that note you mentioned, the one about an 8 o'clock meeting with R.D., it puts him at the scene." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind threading through the details. "Indeed, Mr. Drayton's motive is clear. His brewery was failing, and Tom Carver's deal with Mr. Walsh would have been the final blow. The loan from Carver, meant as kindness, may have stung his pride, turning rivalry into rage." Craddock leaned forward, his voice low. "You think Drayton did it? Struck Carver and pushed him into the vat to make it look accidental?" "It's possible," she said, her tone musing. "But we must consider the others. Miss Price was furious about the sale, believing the brewery was her birthright. Her gloves, stained with grease, suggest she was near the vats, despite her claim of cleaning tanks elsewhere. And young Jack Tully, so loyal to her, his boots carried malt dust, and that cut on his knuckle could indicate a struggle." Craddock rubbed his chin. "Jack's alibi is weak, and he's protective of Ellen, but there's no evidence he was in the vat room. As for Walsh, he was at the Blue Boar by 7:15, confirmed by the innkeeper. His telephone call at 8, though, Lily overheard him talking about no more delays. Sounds like he was pushing someone, but he wasn't at the brewery." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Mr. Walsh's ambition is a strong thread, but his absence from the scene weakens it. Miss Price's anger and Jack's devotion are compelling, but Mr. Drayton's lie about his departure, combined with the note and the wrench, weaves a tighter pattern. I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead, years ago, when a tailor's grudge led to a fatal blow with a heavy iron. Pride and desperation are a dangerous mix." Craddock set down his cup, his eyes narrowing. "We'll bring Drayton in for questioning, test that wrench for blood. If that scrap of paper from his brewery is in the vat room, it could clinch it. But why stage it as an accident? Why not just leave the body?" Miss Marple's fingers brushed her teacup, her mind as sharp as the needle she wasn't holding. "A staged accident diverts suspicion. A man like Drayton, familiar with breweries, would know a fall into a vat could be explained away. He may have struck in anger, then panicked, pushing Carver into the brew to muddy the truth. I've seen it before, a shopkeeper who staged a drowning to hide a poisoning." Craddock stood, his notebook tucked away. "You've given me plenty to work with, Miss Marple. I'll have the vat room searched again and that wrench tested. If Drayton's our man, we'll have him." She smiled, her expression as placid as the village green. "Be thorough, Inspector. The truth is like a dropped stitch. It shows up when you least expect it." After Craddock left, Miss Marple remained in her parlor, her thoughts circling the suspects. Ellen's grief had seemed genuine, but her gloves and her silence about the contract hinted at hidden depths. Jack's loyalty could have driven him to act, but his youth and lack of clear evidence made him a less likely thread. Henry's ambition was potent, but his alibi held, supported by the inn's records. Richard, however, stood out. His lie, the note, the wrench, and the scrap of paper formed a pattern too precise to ignore. She thought of a case from her youth, when a farmer's resentment over a debt had led to a fatal shove, his guilt betrayed by a single muddy footprint. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple resolved to visit the brewery one last time before the truth was fully unraveled. She needed to see the vat room again to confirm the presence of that scrap of paper and perhaps uncover one final clue. For now, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly as her mind wove the final stitches of St. Mary's Mead's latest tragedy, certain that the pattern was nearly complete. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary's Mead bathed in a crisp autumn light that sharpened the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag clasped firmly and her shawl neatly arranged, walked toward the Old Oak Brewery with a sense of quiet purpose. The threads of Tom Carver's murder, the bruise on his neck, the note scheduling a meeting with R.D., the grease-stained wrench, the unsigned contract, Ellen Price's hidden anger, Jack Tully's loyalty, and Henry Walsh's ambition had woven a pattern in her mind, and she was certain now that Richard Drayton held the key. To unravel the final knot, she had persuaded Inspector Craddock to gather the suspects at the brewery, a tactic she'd used before to loosen the tongues of the guilty. The brewery's courtyard was still, save for the faint clink of bottles being crated by a worker. Inside, the vat room gleamed under the electric lights, its copper vats silent witnesses to the tragedy. Craddock had arranged chairs in a semicircle near the fatal vat, and the four suspects, Ellen Price, Henry Walsh, Richard Drayton, and Jack Tully, stood or sat in varying states of unease. Ellen's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Henry, his suit immaculate, leaned back with a forced air of calm, though his fingers tapped a restless rhythm. Jack shifted nervously, his cap twisted in his hands, his eyes darting to Ellen. Richard stood apart, his broad shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor as if it might yield answers. Craddock, his notebook open, began with a brisk authority. "We've new evidence," he said, his voice echoing off the vats. The bruise on Mr. Carver's neck was no accident. He was struck with a heavy object before he was pushed into the vat. We've found a wrench in the brewery, hidden in a corner of this very room, with traces of blood, and a scrap of paper from Drayton's ales, caught near the vat's base. Miss Marple, seated quietly to one side, watched the suspects closely. Ellen's lips parted, but she said nothing, her eyes flicking to Jack. Henry's tapping fingers stilled, his expression unreadable. Jack's flush deepened, his hands tightening on his cap. Richard's head jerked up, his face ashen. "That's nothing to do with me," he said, his voice rough. "I told you, I left by 7. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. Yet the note in Mr. Carver's office, Mr. Drayton, suggests otherwise. Meet R.D., 8 p.m., vat room. And a worker saw your car near the brewery at 9. Why did you lie about your departure?" Richard's hands clenched, his eyes darting to the vat. I forgot the time. We argued about the partnership, yes, but I left after, I swear it." Craddock stepped forward, holding up a sealed bag containing the wrench, its handle gleaming with grease. "This was found this morning, tucked behind a pipe. The blood matches Carver's, and this—" He held up another bag with a torn scrap of paper, the Drayton's Ales logo faintly visible. "Was near the vat. Care to explain, Drayton?" Ellen's voice broke the silence, sharp with strain. "That could be anyone's. We get their bottles for recycling sometimes." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. Ellen's defense of Richard was unexpected, perhaps a reflex to protect the brewery's reputation, or something deeper. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead when a maid's quick defense of a friend had masked her own guilt. "A generous thought, Miss Price," she said gently, "but the note and the car place Mr. Drayton here at the critical hour, and the wrench, I believe, came from your office, Mr. Drayton." Richard's face crumpled, and he sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. "I didn't mean to kill him," he blurted, his voice breaking. "I went to talk about the loan, the partnership. Tom laughed at me, said he was selling to Walsh, that my brewery was finished. I lost my temper, grabbed the wrench, swung it just once. He fell, hit the vat's edge. I panicked, pushed him in to make it look like he slipped. I didn't know he was dead." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling like dust. Ellen's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Jack stepped closer to her, his face pale but resolute. Henry's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. His deal now secure, with Carver gone. Craddock signaled to the constable, who moved to Richard's side, handcuffs ready. Miss Marple rose, her expression serene but tinged with sadness. "Pride and desperation, Mr. Drayton," she said softly. "They've undone many a man. I recall a case years ago when a carpenter struck his rival over a debt, thinking one blow would settle it. It never does." Craddock nodded, his voice firm. "You're under arrest, Drayton. We'll need a full statement." As the constable led Richard away, the brewery seemed to exhale, its silence heavier than before. Miss Marple stepped into the courtyard, the sunlight warming her face. The truth had been unraveled, but it brought no joy, only the quiet satisfaction of a pattern completed. She thought of Tom Carver, his laughter silenced, and of Richard, whose rage had cost him everything. Human nature, she knew, was as predictable as it was tragic, and St. Mary's Mead would carry this scar for years to come. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, its golden rays softening the sharp edges of the village's grief. The old oak brewery, though still standing proud with its stone walls and gleaming vats, seemed quieter now, as if mourning the loss of Tom Carver's guiding hand. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, walked the short distance from her cottage to the brewery, her steps slow but steady. The arrest of Richard Drayton had rippled through the village like a pebble in a pond, stirring whispers and sighs, but Miss Marple knew that truth, once uncovered, left wounds that needed tending. She intended to see how those left behind were faring. The brewery's courtyard was alive with cautious activity. Workers moved barrels, their voices subdued, and the scent of fermenting hops drifted on the breeze. Ellen Price stood near the great oak doors, her apron dusted with malt, her face set with a determination Miss Marple had not seen before. The older woman approached, her smile gentle, but her eyes keen, noting the faint lines of strain around Ellen's mouth. "Miss Price," she said, her voice as soft as the autumn light, "I thought I might find you here, keeping things in order." Ellen turned, her hands pausing on a clipboard of brewing notes. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone steady but tinged with weariness. "Someone's got to keep the vats going. Tom wouldn't have wanted Old Oak to stop, not even for this." They sat on a bench near the courtyard, the brewery's hum a quiet backdrop. Miss Marple's fingers brushed her handbag, where the threads of the case, the wrench, the note, the scrap of Drayton's Ales paper had been neatly tied. "You've a heavy burden now," she said, her eyes soft, "but I suspect you're equal to it." Ellen's jaw tightened, and she looked toward the vats, their copper surfaces catching the light. "I have to be. Tom taught me everything, how to balance the malt, time the boil. He said Old Oak was more than beer, it was the village's heart. I won't let it die, not after all this." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Ellen's earlier anger, the grease-stained gloves, the notebook she'd clutched so tightly. The young woman's grief had been real, but so had her sense of betrayal over the potential sale to Henry Walsh. "It's a fine legacy to carry," she said, her tone musing. "Though it must be hard, knowing Mr. Carver considered another path." Ellen's eyes flashed, but the fire was tempered now. "He made a mistake, thinking of that deal with Walsh. But I understand it now. Business, pressure, money. He was human. I'll make sure Old Oak stays ours, not some city chains." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, recognizing the resolve that had replaced Ellen's resentment. She thought of a case from her youth when a seamstress had taken over her mistress's shop after a scandal, turning grief into purpose. Ellen, she sensed, would do the same. "And you've help, I see," she said, nodding toward Jack Tully, who was stacking crates nearby, his lanky frame moving with quiet efficiency, his eyes straying to Ellen. Ellen's expression softened. "Jack's a good lad, loyal to a fault. He's learning the trade, and he's got heart. Tom saw it in him, too." Miss Marple noted the warmth in her voice, the way Jack's shoulders straightened at Ellen's glance. His loyalty, once a thread of suspicion, was now a strength binding him to the brewery's future. She recalled a young baker who'd stood by his employer through a theft, his devotion proving his worth. "He'll be a fine asset," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Young men need purpose, and you'll give him that." As they spoke, the brewery's gates creaked open, and Henry Walsh's sleek car rolled out, his deal unsigned and his ambitions thwarted. Miss Marple watched him go, his polished exterior unchanged but his plans in tatters. "Mr. Walsh will find other ventures," she said, her voice soft. "Men like him always do." Ellen's lips twitched, a hint of a smile. "Good riddance. Old Oak's better off without him." Miss Marple rose, her mission complete. The brewery would heal under Ellen's care, and Jack's loyalty would anchor her. The village, too, was stirring back to life, the gossip turning to harvest fairs and church suppers. She thought of Richard Drayton, now in custody, his pride and desperation a cautionary tale. A case from St. Mary's Mead came to mind, where a grocer's envy had led to a fire, his regret as futile as Drayton's. Human nature, she knew, wove the same patterns, time and again. As she walked home, the village green glowed under the setting sun, children playing near the church, their laughter a balm to the recent shadows. Miss Marple's knitting awaited her, but for now, she let the village's rhythm wash over her, the threads of the tragedy neatly tied, the pattern complete. Chapter 12. A Quiet Reflection. The late afternoon light bathed St. Mary's Mead in a gentle glow, softening the village's cobblestone lanes and thatched roofs as if to cradle its healing heart. Miss Jane Marple, her walking stick tapping a soft rhythm, made her way toward St. Mary's Church, her steps unhurried but purposeful. The arrest of Richard Drayton for Tom Carver's murder had settled the village's unrest, but Miss Marple knew that peace, like a well-knitted shawl, required time to set properly. The brewery was stirring back to life under Ellen Price's steady hand, and the whispers of scandal were fading, replaced by talk of autumn harvests and the upcoming church bazaar. Yet Miss Marple felt a need for quiet reflection, a moment to tie the final thread of the tragedy that had shaken her village. The church stood at the heart of St. Mary's Mead, its stone walls weathered but steadfast, its spire a beacon against the amber sky. Inside, the air was cool and scented with wax and old hymnals, the stained glass windows casting jeweled patterns on the pews. Miss Marple slipped into her usual seat near the back, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracing the familiar lines of the altar. The organist, practicing for Sunday's service, filled the space with a somber melody, its notes weaving through her thoughts like the stitches of her knitting. She reflected on the case, its threads now neatly aligned, the bruise on Tom Carver's neck, struck by Richard's wrench in a moment of rage, the note placing him at the vat room, the scrap of Drayton's Ales paper, a silent witness to his guilt. Ellen's anger, Jack's loyalty, and Henry Walsh's ambition had all been potent threads, but they had unraveled under scrutiny, leaving Richard's desperation as the true knot. Miss Marple thought of a case from her girlhood when a miller's envy had led to a fatal push into a river, his guilt revealed by a torn glove. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as it was frail, its patterns repeating across generations. The brewery, she knew, would thrive under Ellen's care. The young woman's resolve had hardened like tempered steel, and Jack's devotion would bolster her efforts. Henry Walsh had left St. Mary's Mead, his unsigned contract a footnote in the village's story, and the gossip about him had already turned to fresher scandals. Richard Drayton, now awaiting trial, would carry the weight of his actions, his pride and rivalry reduced to a cell's confines. Miss Marple sighed softly, her heart heavy with the waste of it all. Murder, she knew, solved nothing, only tore at the fabric of lives, leaving holes that time could only partially mend. The organ's notes swelled, and she closed her eyes, letting the music guide her thoughts. The village would heal, as it always did, its rhythm as steady as the seasons. Old Oak's ales would flow again, carrying Tom Carver's legacy in every pint. Ellen would brew new recipes, perhaps naming one for her mentor, and Jack would learn at her side, his loyalty a bridge to the future. Miss Marple smiled faintly, picturing the brewery's vats humming, the village green alive with laughter, the church filled with voices raised in song. She rose, her movements slow but sure, and stepped outside, the evening air cool against her face. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. As she walked home, the village seemed to breathe with her, its wounds knitting together, its heart beating strong. Miss Marple's cottage awaited, her knitting basket by the fire, ready to take up the next pattern. But for now, she let the quiet of St. Mary's Mead envelop her, certain that another puzzle, another knot, would soon emerge, waiting for her patient hands to unravel.